A German shepherd froze at the edge of a forbidden Montana trail, refusing to move as the helicopter thunder faded over Lake McDonald. Deep in the pines, two lost hikers were still breathing. A Navy SEAL lay silent beside a stunned bear. But the dog had found something worse than danger. If you believe God still sends help where truth is buried, leave amen. Lake McDonald looked almost too beautiful for an emergency. Morning light poured over the water in long silver ribbons, turning the surface into a mirror for the snow-touched peaks above Glacier National Park. The air smelled of pine sap, damp earth, and hot coffee drifting from the small ranger station near the lodge. Wooden cabins stood beneath tall evergreens, their windows catching the pale blue sky, while the first tourists of May moved softly along the road, unaware that somewhere beyond the bright lake and the singing birds, 3 people had vanished into trouble. Special Agent Elara Whitcomb stood beside a black Federal SUV in the gravel lot, one hand resting lightly on the open rear door. She was 30 years old, with chestnut brown hair tied low at the back of her neck, fair skin warmed by years of fieldwork, and gray-blue eyes that seemed calm until someone looked closely enough to see the sorrow behind them. Elara had learned young that mountains could keep secrets. Her older brother had once gone into a high-country trail and never returned in time to be saved. Since then, she had carried her grief like a compass, quiet, heavy, and always pointing her toward the missing. Beside her, K9 Sable stepped down from the vehicle with the solemn grace of a creature who knew work was waiting. He was a 5-year-old German shepherd with a true sable coat, dark along the back and shoulders, golden brown at the legs, his ears sharp and upright, his deep brown eyes watchful without being restless. Sable was not a loud dog. He did not waste energy on show. He observed, breathed, listened, and when something in the world did not belong, he had a way of stilling the air around him. To Elara, he was more than a trained partner. He was the part of the forest that had agreed to walk beside her. The first call had come through National Park Service Search and Rescue just after sunrise. 2 tourists from a guided North Star Ridge expeditions trip were missing near a side route not recommended for public travel, somewhere beyond the approaches to Mount Brown Trail. The group had reported a bear encounter, confusion, and separation. NPS, park rangers, county search teams, and paramedics were already moving. The FBI had not been called in to lead the rescue. Not yet. But then a park dispatcher mentioned the guided route did not match the company's filed plan. The tourists were from out of state. The trip had been sold online as a premium wilderness experience, and one tracking device, according to the company's own message, had stopped transmitting unexpectedly. That was why Elara was here. She had been in Kalispell assisting with a separate inquiry into outdoor tour advertising across state lines, the kind of case that sounded dull on paper until dullness became danger. Companies promised safety, exclusivity, and expert guidance. Sometimes they delivered. Sometimes they sold courage to people who did not know the price of fear. Ranger Walt Mercer met her beside the trail operations table, where maps were pinned down with coffee mugs and smooth river stones. Walt was 62, tall but slightly stooped, with a weather-browned face, silver beard, and pale eyes narrowed by decades of sun, snow, and reading weather before it arrived. He had the quiet authority of a man who had pulled too many hikers back from bad decisions and carried the memories of those he could not. His voice was low, rough around the edges, but never careless. "Agent Whitcomb," he said, tipping his hat. "Wish we were meeting under kinder skies." Elara looked beyond him at the shining lake. "The skies look kind enough." "That's the trick of this place." Walt glanced toward the trees. "It smiles while it tests you." He explained the situation quickly. North Star claimed the group had followed a safe scenic route and that their safety consultant, Caleb Rourke, had separated from the group during the bear encounter. Caleb was 34, former Navy SEAL, hired for risk assessment on higher-end trips. According to North Star, he had moved off alone after the confusion and had not been reached since. Ilara's expression barely changed, but something in her chest tightened. A trained safety consultant left 2 missing clients behind? Walt's mouth flattened. That bothered me too. Who filed the route plan? North Star submitted the main trail plan, but the surviving radio fragments suggest they may have taken what they call a premium scenic cut. Is it approved? No, it's an informal connector at best, thick brush, low visibility, old deadfall, and close to a berry patch. Walt tapped the map with one blunt finger. I sent notice last week about bear activity in that pocket. North Star was on the list. A sudden crack snapped through the trees, sharp as a dry branch breaking under an unseen foot. Every voice at the operations table stopped. Even the lake seemed to hold its breath. Sable lifted his head, ears high, eyes fixed on the dark green wall of forest, and for one strange second, Ilara felt the morning turn from beautiful to watchful. A young county SAR volunteer hurried in from the trail edge, cheeks flushed, red jacket unzipped. "Just a limb," he called, embarrassed. Old snag dropped near the access road. The others exhaled and returned to their maps, but Sable did not relax. He took one slow step forward, nose tilted toward a stand of alder that sat slightly away from the marked route. Ilara knew that look. Sable had heard nothing more than a falling branch, perhaps, but he had scented something else beneath it. Fabric, fear, metal, mud, the thin human trace that remained when panic passed through a place. Ilara clipped his lead and held out a sealed evidence bag containing a cloth strap from Caleb's field pack, along with 2 smaller scent articles from the missing tourists, Marion Wells and Peter Lang. Marion was 57, a retired school teacher from Oregon with silver blonde hair and a careful, hopeful face in the photo NPS had printed. Peter was 61, a Minnesota amateur photographer with a round face, wire-rimmed glasses, and the gentle smile of a man who trusted landscapes more than people. They had come north chasing beauty. Now beauty had swallowed their path. Sable sniffed each article, then stood perfectly still. He did not pull toward the wide trail where boots had already pressed the dirt flat. Instead, he angled toward the side growth. His body tightened, not with excitement, but with certainty. Walt watched him. "Your dog doesn't like our company map." "Sable doesn't care about company maps," Ilara said. "He cares where people actually went." They moved carefully. NPS remained in command of the rescue, but Ilara and Sable worked the scent line alongside the rangers. 10 minutes beyond the staging area, Sable stopped at a low branch where a torn strip of nylon hung from the thorny brush. It was dark blue, the same color as Marion's daypack in her photo. A few yards farther, the soil showed confused boot marks, overlapping and turned in different directions, as if the group had paused there and lost confidence all at once. Then Walt found the printed North Star map half folded under wet leaves. Its glossy surface showed a cheerful dotted line labeled Premium Scenic Cut. Walt placed it beside the NPS map and shook his head. "That is not a private trail," he said. "That is a poor idea, with a fancy name." Ilara photographed the map, then bagged it. She felt the old familiar shift inside her, the moment when a search stopped being only a search. Somewhere between the sunshine and the mud, someone had polished a risk until it looked like adventure. Sable moved again, slower now. Near a patch of soft ground below a rotting log, he lowered his nose, pawed once, and uncovered a small GPS unit pressed into the mud. Ilara crouched and lifted it with gloved fingers. The casing was scratched, but intact. The screen stayed black. Walt leaned over her shoulder. "Battery!" Ilara checked the side switch. Her voice dropped. No, it was turned off. Far across Lake McDonald, a rescue helicopter began to beat its way through the clean blue morning, the sound rolling over the water like a drum from some old mountain warning. Sable placed one sable paw beside the dead GPS and looked up at Ilara with eyes deep enough to hold the whole forest. Ilara looked from the dark screen to the bright trees ahead. "If this was turned off before the encounter," she said quietly to Walt, "we are not just looking for missing people anymore. We are looking for a truth someone tried to leave behind in the woods." The search grid opened like a careful prayer across the Montana woods. Orange flags marked the edges of each assigned section, radios murmured beneath the wind, and the noon sun laid warm gold over the tops of the pines as if the forest had no memory of fear. Lake McDonald glittered far behind them, bright and innocent, while ahead the land rose into thicker timber, old deadfall, berry brush, and narrow ground where a person could lose the trail in 3 careless steps. National Park Service Search and Rescue remained in command. Elara Whitcomb moved with them, not as the hero of the operation, but as a federal investigator with a dog who could hear the hidden story beneath mud, pine needles, and human panic. Chai Nine Sable worked low and steady at the end of the lead, his sable coat catching flashes of sunlight whenever he passed through an opening in the trees. He did not pull wildly. He moved like a monk following a sacred line, nose close to the earth, ears shifting at every bird call and branch scrape. Elara watched him more than she watched the map. Sable had already rejected North Star's cheerful printed route. Now he followed what the forest remembered: a woman's torn packstrap, scattered boot prints, and the sharp scent of fear pressed into damp soil. Ranger Walt Mercer walked a few yards behind Elara, one hand near his radio, his weathered face set in that grim patience common to men who had learned not to rush mountains. With him was Maggie Hollis, a county SAR medic in her early 40s, compact and strong, with copper-red hair tucked beneath a helmet, and brown eyes that missed very little. Maggie had the brisk kindness of a woman who could start an IV in rough weather and still remember to speak gently to the frightened. She carried a medical pack nearly half her size and moved through the brush without complaint. Sable stopped near a cluster of gray stone rising from the slope like old bones. He lifted his head, gave one short breath through his nose, then angled left. A faint sound came from beyond the rocks, not a scream, not even a call, but a dry, broken cough. Elara raised her hand. "Hold!" Walt signaled the team behind them. Maggie moved forward, careful and quick. Behind the stone, beneath a leaning pine, they found Marion Wells and Peter Lang. Marion was 57, a retired schoolteacher from Oregon, though in that moment she looked smaller than her photograph, wrapped in a silver emergency blanket with pine needles caught in her silver blonde hair. Her face was pale, her lips dry, but her eyes still held the disciplined tenderness of someone who had spent a lifetime calming children through fire drills, scraped knees, and bad news. Peter Lang sat beside her with his camera strap twisted around one wrist. He was 61, round-faced, with wire-rimmed glasses bent slightly at one hinge and a gray beard peppered with bits of moss. His hands trembled, not from weakness alone, but from the memory of something too large moving too close. Maggie knelt at once. "You're safe now. I'm going to check you both." Marion looked past her, straight at Elara. "Caleb," she whispered. "He made us come here. He said not to run." Elara crouched at a respectful distance. "Caleb Rourke?" Peter nodded, swallowing hard. "He told us to stay together. He kept his voice so calm, like he was talking us through Sunday traffic instead of—" His words failed him, and he pressed a shaking hand over his mouth. Marion closed her eyes. The bear came out near the fallen trees. It was just there, too close. The guide froze. I think I froze too. Caleb didn't. He stepped sideways, away from us. He made himself the thing it noticed. "He told us," Peter said, voice rough. "Keep moving. Stay together. Don't come back unless I call your names." Then he blew a whistle and moved away from the rocks. Elara felt the words settle in her chest. Not reckless, not careless. Tactical. Caleb had not abandoned them. He had bought them time. Then Sable turned sharply toward the deeper trees, and a low sound rose from his throat, not a bark, not a warning, but a mournful note that made every person on the slope fall silent. The wind shifted, carrying the faint sting of bear spray through the warm pine air, and for one suspended heartbeat, even Marion stopped trembling. Walt's face tightened. "He's got something." Maggie arranged evacuation for Marion and Peter with 2 SAR volunteers, both found tired and shaken, but not in life-threatening condition. Marion caught Alara's sleeve before leaving. "Please find him. He saved us, like we mattered." Alara looked at the older woman's weathered, pleading face. "We will do everything we can." Sable moved again, deeper into a narrow cut of forest where the ground sloped beneath slick moss and old deadfall stacked in tangled lines. The air changed there. It grew cooler, darker, thick with the smell of crushed leaves, damp bark, and the bitter trace of deployed bear spray. Walt studied the earth as they walked. He pointed out scuffed soil, a scraped trunk, berry bushes pressed down, and a long slide mark where someone had lost footing. "This was no clean trail," he said. "This was confusion." "No," Alara answered softly, watching Sable work. "This was direction under pressure." They followed the scent line until Sable stopped so suddenly Alara nearly stepped into him. The dog lowered his body, ears forward, eyes fixed on a pocket of shadow between 2 fallen trees. He did not surge ahead. He did not make a sound now. His stillness was more frightening than barking. Alara raised a closed fist. The team froze. Through the branches, she saw him. Caleb Rourke lay on his side near the base of a fallen cedar, one arm bent beneath him, his dark hair matted with rain and forest debris, his short beard shadowing a face drained of color. He was broad-shouldered, even in collapse, dressed in a torn field jacket and hiking pants scuffed by stone and bark. One hand still held the cracked remains of an emergency whistle. A few yards beyond him, partly wedged among deadfall and brush, was the bear, large, breathing, disoriented, and no longer advancing. Alara's first instinct was to run to Caleb. Training stopped her. Mercy without caution could create a second emergency. "Back," Walt said quietly into the radio. "We have subject located. Wildlife present. Need specialist and tranquilizer team. Establish perimeter now." Sable remained beside Alara, muscles tight but obedient. She shortened his lead and kept him behind her leg. The dog's brown eyes never left Caleb. Minutes stretched thin. Wildlife specialist doctor. Nora Keene arrived from a nearby response unit, a lean woman in her 50s with dark-cropped hair, sun-lined skin, and the calm expression of someone who respected large animals too much to fear them carelessly. She studied the bear through binoculars, listened to Walt's description, and gave clear instructions. The bear appeared alive but impaired by spray, exhaustion, terrain, and the deadfall restricting its movement. No one would approach until she cleared the scene. A tranquilizer was prepared. The team held their positions. The forest seemed to breathe around them. Only after Dr. Keene confirmed the bear was sedated and safely monitored did Maggie move to Caleb. Alara followed just behind. Sable held back with Walt. Maggie checked Caleb's pulse, then looked up with sudden light in her face. "He's alive." The words moved through the team like sunrise. Caleb's eyelids fluttered when Maggie fitted oxygen near his face. His gray eyes opened only halfway, unfocused, but they found Alara's outline. His voice came out thin and rough. "Did they make it?" Alara knelt beside him, careful not to crowd him. "They made it. Marion and Peter are safe because you gave them time." His eyes closed again, and something like peace softened the hard lines of his face. He tried to speak once more, but his strength failed. As the team prepared the litter, Sable stepped forward, only when Alara allowed him, slow and solemn. He lowered his nose near Caleb's pack, then tugged gently at a muddy strap. Alara bent down. Wedged deep in the seam was a tiny memory card, dirty but intact. She slipped it into an evidence pouch, her pulse quiet but alert. Caleb had protected more than people out here. Somehow, before the forest took his voice, he had tried to protect the truth. The helicopter came over the treetops in a roar of wind and light. Caleb was carried out beneath the spinning blades, still breathing, still fighting in the quiet way some people did. Behind them, Dr. Keene and the wildlife team remained with the sedated bear, speaking in low, respectful voices. Walt made it clear to everyone on scene, no conclusions yet, no blame placed on the animal. Early signs pointed to a surprise encounter in a place humans should not have entered so carelessly. Sable sat beside Ilara at the edge of the clearing, watching both rescues unfold. The man lifted toward the sky, the bear examined beneath the trees. Ilara held the evidence pouch in her gloved hand and looked back at the leaf-covered root Northstar had dressed up with a pretty name. For the first time that day, the truth felt close enough to breathe on her neck. Caleb Rourke and the bear had both survived. And Ilara was beginning to understand that both of them might have been placed in danger by the same human lie. Caleb Rourke woke in a white room that smelled of antiseptic, warm blankets, and rain-soaked wool. For a few seconds he did not know where he was. The ceiling above him was too smooth to be sky, the light too steady to be morning through pine branches. His right shoulder was strapped and braced, his ribs ached when he breathed, and his hands felt heavy, as if the forest had tried to keep them. A heart monitor blinked beside him with patient green lines, each soft beep proving what his body still did not quite believe. He was alive. The thought came slowly, almost shyly, like a small bird returning to a tree after thunder. Special Agent Ilara Whitcomb sat near the window, not too close, not too far. She wore a dark field jacket over a gray shirt, her chestnut-brown hair tied low, her gray-blue eyes calm but watchful. She had the rare kind of stillness that did not make a room colder. It made it safer. At the foot of the bed, K9 Sable lay on the polished floor with his sable coat catching a faint stripe of afternoon sun. The 5-year-old German shepherd did not sleep. His ears rested halfway up, his deep brown eyes fixed on Caleb with the grave expression of a furry old judge who had not yet decided whether the witness was telling the whole truth. A nurse checked Caleb's IV before Ilara spoke. Nurse Hannah Pike was a soft-faced woman in her late 50s, with silver hair pinned into a neat twist, pale freckles across her cheeks, and the steady hands of someone who had seen fear arrive in many forms and had learned to greet it gently. "Only a few minutes," she told Ilara, her voice kind but firm. "He needs rest more than questions." Caleb gave a faint, dry laugh that almost became a cough. "Ma'am, I've been resting in the woods. I'd rather answer questions." Hannah looked at him over her glasses. That was not rest. That was poor judgment with pine needles. Even Ilara's mouth softened at the edge. When Hannah left, Ilara placed a small recorder on the bedside table, but did not turn it on right away. "We can wait," she said. Caleb looked at the window. Beyond the hospital glass, Kalispell sat under a pale Montana sky, ordinary cars moving along ordinary roads, all of it strange after the deep green silence of Glacier. "No," he said. His voice was rough, scraped thin by cold and exhaustion. "If Northstar starts talking first, they'll make it sound clean." He swallowed. It wasn't clean. Ilara turned on the recorder. Caleb began with the route. Northstar had not taken the filed trail, not exactly. The company had changed the plan that morning, calling the new path a premium scenic cut, the sort of phrase that sounded expensive enough to silence common sense. It was narrower, less traveled, and crowded with old deadfall. Visibility dropped in places to only a few yards. Caleb had disliked it the moment he saw it. He had spent years reading ground, wind, cover, and human fear. That stretch of forest did not feel adventurous to him. It felt crowded with things unseen. The lead guide, Lena Crow, had tried to appear confident. Caleb described her as 29, slim and sharp-shouldered, with ash-blonde hair tucked beneath a green cap and a face too tired for someone so young. She was not careless by nature, he said. She checked straps, counted water bottles, and kept asking guests if their boots felt right. But her confidence had cracks in it. Every time the radio hissed, she stiffened. Every time Caleb questioned the route, she glanced away, as if his words had placed her between truth and rent money. "She told me the office wanted the premium path," Caleb said. "Guests paid for quiet views, no crowds, no disappointment." He closed his eyes. That's the kind of sentence people say before nature corrects them. Before the encounter, Caleb noticed signs that made the back of his neck tighten. Fresh bark rubbed raw on a tree. Berry brush pressed down. Damp soil turned in a broad pattern near the trail edge. A strong, wild scent riding low on the wind. He told Lena they needed to stop, regroup, and return to wider ground. Then the radio crackled. A man's voice came through, impatient and clipped. Caleb did not see his face then, but later Ilara would identify him as Miles Harrow, North Star's operations coordinator, a short, narrow-built man in his early 40s with thinning brown hair, restless eyes, and the brittle tone of someone used to passing orders downward while fear traveled upward. Miles said the guests had paid for the experience. Miles said they could not turn back without clear cause. Miles said to keep moving. The heart monitor suddenly gave a sharper beep as Caleb's breathing changed, and Sable lifted his head at once. For one silent second, the hospital room vanished. In Caleb's eyes there was only green shadow, a broken branch, and something large moving where no large thing should have been. Then Sable rose, placed one steady paw against the side of the bed, and the room came back around him like a hand closing gently over a flame. Caleb touched the edge of Sable's paw with 2 fingers. "Good dog," he whispered, then continued. The bear had not charged from far away. It appeared too close from behind a cluster of fallen trees, startled into the same terrible moment as the humans. It rose part way, huffed, shook its head, then dropped down again. Caleb knew the worst danger was not the animal alone. It was panic. If Marion and Peter ran, if Lena screamed, if someone waved food or stumbled into the bear's path, the woods would decide faster than any human could think. He lowered his voice and told Marion and Peter to back toward the rocks. "Stay together. Do not run. Do not stare. Keep moving." He stepped sideways, away from them, opening his jacket to make himself larger. He spoke low, not because he thought the bear understood English, but because people do. His calm was a rope for the others to hold. Then a snack pouch slipped from Lena's shaking hand and landed near the brush. Caleb did not blame her when he told it. That mattered to Ilara. He only said, "Fear makes fingers weak." He blew one short note on his whistle and tossed his outer jacket to the side, creating motion away from Marion and Peter. When the bear's attention shifted, he retreated toward the deadfall. Not open ground, not hero ground. Bad ground for a large body. Narrow space, fallen timber, moss-slick slope, a place where the forest itself might slow what no man could overpower. The bear spray came out when the distance became too close. The first burst failed to do what he hoped. Wind curled through the trees and pushed part of it back into Caleb's eyes. He could barely see. Still, it bought him a few seconds. He backed farther, slipped on moss, and struck his old shoulder against a root. Pain flashed white through him. He remembered hearing Marion cry out from somewhere behind him, and that sound made him move again when his body wanted to stay down. The second burst of spray worked better. The bear recoiled, disoriented, then drove forward into the deadfall instead of around it. Caleb used the fallen cedar as a barrier, rolling away whenever he could, keeping wood between himself and the animal. His survival knife came out only at the end, not as a weapon of triumph, but as a last desperate tool to keep distance when the bear pressed through a narrow gap. He did not speak of victory. There was no pride in his voice, only respect and a weary sadness. "It wasn't me against her," Caleb said. It was fear against fear. I was trying to protect people. She was trying to survive the surprise we brought to her door." Ilara wrote that sentence down. At the final moment, the bear pushed through the slick gap, lost balance against the broken timber, and struck the wet slope hard enough to stun itself. The spray, the terrain, the exhaustion, the confusion, all of it came together. Caleb tried to crawl toward the rocks to see if Marion and Peter had made it. His hand found the action camera that had fallen from Lena's shoulder strap. He remembered the route, the radio, the warning he had given. So he pulled the memory card with clumsy fingers and shoved it into the seam of his own pack. Then he pressed the emergency beacon. Nothing happened. He pressed again. Still nothing. After that, the forest folded over him. Ilara compared his words with the evidence. The dead GPS, the failed beacon, the spray trace on the leaves, the slide marks, the jacket fibers, Marion and Peter's statements, the memory card Sable had found. Piece by piece, the truth did not shine like lightning. It gathered like dawn. Caleb looked toward Sable, who still watched him with solemn concern. "Your dog looks like he's grading my performance." "She is," Ilara said, though Sable was very much a male dog and seemed too dignified to correct either of them. "And I think he believes you passed." "Barely." For the first time since waking, Caleb smiled. It was small, tired, and gone almost at once, but it changed the room. Ilara stood, turning off the recorder. "Rest now. We will verify the footage." Caleb's eyes drifted shut. "Agent Whitcomb," he murmured. "Don't let them call it an accident if it wasn't one." Ilara did not answer, with a promise she could not yet prove. She only looked at Sable, then at the evidence pouch in her hand. Later, in a secure NPS office, she opened the footage. The screen shook with trees, breath, and hurried boots. Caleb's voice warned them to stop. Then the radio crackled, and Miles Harrow's clipped voice cut through the forest. "Keep the clients moving. We cannot afford another canceled route." Ilara froze the video. Outside the window, the Montana afternoon lay bright and peaceful over the mountains. But inside the small office, the case changed shape. This was no longer only a wilderness emergency. It was a human decision wearing the mask of bad luck. By the next morning, the case no longer belonged only to the forest. It had stepped out from under the pines and entered the colder world of records, signatures, online advertisements, radio logs, safety checklists, and men who used careful words to hide careless choices. Ilara Whitcomb sat inside a temporary NPS conference room near Lake McDonald, where maps covered one wall and the windows looked out toward water so blue it seemed almost innocent. K9 Sable lay at her feet, his sable coat dark against the wooden floor, his ears rising every time a radio crackled. He had slept little since finding Caleb, but he remained alert, as if the forest had whispered something unfinished into his fur. Across the table sat Assistant U.S. Attorney Mara Vance, a woman in her early 40s with short black hair, olive skin, and sharp hazel eyes that carried both intelligence and impatience. She wore a navy blazer over hiking boots, a combination that told Ilara she had come prepared for court and mud alike. Mara had a calm legal voice, but there was steel under it, the kind shaped by years of watching powerful people pretend paperwork could make truth disappear. Beside her, Walt Mercer stood with his arms folded, his silver beard catching the morning light. He looked like an old tree that had finally decided to testify. "The FBI angle is clean enough," Mara said, tapping Caleb's statement with one pen. "Out-of-state clients, online sales, paid premium route, possible wire fraud, falsified safety documentation, equipment failure, evidence manipulation on federal land. NPS law enforcement keeps the park incident. You coordinate the broader criminal inquiry." Ilara nodded. "We move carefully. North Star will call this government overreach." "They already are," Mara said. She turned a laptop toward the room. On the screen, North Star Ridge Expeditions had released a polished statement. Then came Dorian Vale. Dorian was 48, tall and lean, with silver-threaded hair combed back from a handsome face that looked practiced in mirrors. He wore a dark green expedition jacket that likely cost more than most family tents, and behind him stood a backdrop of mountains, company logos, and soft sympathy. His voice was low, controlled, almost tender. He spoke of tragedy, unpredictable wilderness, heroic rescue teams, and prayers for recovery. Then he said Caleb Rourke had apparently separated from the approved group path during the confusion, and Ilara felt the room tighten. Sable lifted his head. Walt muttered, "That man could sell smoke to a chimney." Dorian continued, his expression sorrowful but smooth. "North Star has always followed rigorous safety procedures. We are cooperating fully." Ilara watched his eyes. They did not move like a grieving man's eyes. They moved like a man counting exits. The screen went dark. Mara closed the laptop. "He's getting ahead of the story." "No," Ilara said. "He's trying to choose the story before the evidence can speak." They began with Walt's warnings. In a folder worn at the edges, he showed Ilara copies of notices sent to local outdoor companies the week before. Recent bear activity near a berry patch. Avoid informal connector paths. Update client briefings. Verify safety gear. North Star had received the notice. Someone from their office had even acknowledged it by email with a polite reply and a little green leaf emoji, as if respect for nature could be proved with decoration. Later that afternoon, Ilara and Sable accompanied NPS law enforcement to North Star's temporary equipment storage area near a service road outside Columbia Falls. The building was small, metal-sided, and painted a cheerful mountain blue. It smelled of wet rope, plastic rain ponchos, old coffee, and the faint sourness of gear put away too quickly. Sable entered slowly, nose working. He passed rows of trekking poles, branded water bottles, and folded emergency blankets, then stopped near a gray bin marked "Used to inspect." Inside, Ilara found a bear spray canister past its expiration date. Not dramatically ancient, not a smoking thunderbolt of guilt, but enough. Enough to show carelessness. Enough to matter. Sable then nosed toward a trash bag near the office door. Walt opened it carefully. Near the bottom, under paper cups and a torn granola wrapper, lay the remains of a ripped checklist. Ilara pieced the strips together on a clean table. Safety briefing completed. Bear activity update reviewed. Satellite beacon tested. Route confirmed with NPS map. Every box had been checked. Marion and Peter had already said no real briefing happened. Caleb's beacon had failed. The route had not matched NPS records. The paper did not feel like safety. It felt like a mask. Just then, from somewhere inside the storage room wall, a phone began to vibrate, low, trapped, and frantic, like a bee sealed inside a jar. Everyone froze. Sable rose in one smooth motion, ears high, eyes fixed on a stack of rain jackets. Ilara moved them aside and found a company radiophone blinking with a missed call from M. Harrow. The screen glowed in the dim room, and for a moment the silence felt alive. Mara approved the next step. Speak with Lena Crow. Lena lived in a rented cabin near Columbia Falls, tucked under tall cottonwoods beside a narrow gravel lane. When she opened the door, she looked even smaller than Caleb's description. She was 29, slim, with ash-blonde hair loose around her shoulders, pale skin marked by sleeplessness, and gray eyes ringed with dark shadows. Her hands were wrapped around a chipped mug of tea she had not been drinking. She had the look of someone who had been waiting for a knock and fearing it at the same time. "I already gave a statement to the company attorney," Lena said. Ilara stood on the porch, Sable beside her. "I'm not the company attorney." Lena's mouth trembled. "That's what scares me." Inside, the cabin was tidy in the desperate way people clean when they cannot control anything else. A pair of muddy boots stood by the door. A framed photo showed Lena at 19 on a mountain ridge, smiling with the bright confidence of someone who still believed loving the outdoors was enough to protect her from the outdoor industry. Ilara did not sit until Lena did. "Caleb says you were pressured to continue." Lena looked away. "Caleb was always careful. Too careful, according to North Star." "According to Dorian Vale?" "According to everyone who wanted 5-star reviews." Sable stepped forward, not crowding her, not demanding. He simply sat in front of Lena, his brown eyes steady, his black-tipped ears still. Something in that quiet presence broke what Ilara's badge could not. Lena began to cry. She told them North Star often asked guides to sign checklists after trips, not before. Gear was inspected when time allowed, which meant when no paying group was waiting. The premium scenic cut was never called unsafe in writing. It was called exclusive, intimate, wild, a better guest experience. Guides who complained lost shifts. Guides who canceled too often were labeled not brand aligned. "I needed the job," Lena whispered. "Rent, loans, my mother's prescriptions. That doesn't excuse it. I know that. But every time I wanted to push back, they made it sound like I was hurting the whole team." Ilara's voice stayed even. "You still led them forward." Lena flinched, but she nodded. "Yes?" The honesty mattered. So did the harm. Lena opened a drawer and handed Ilara printed screenshots. A message from Miles Harrow read, "Dorian wants no cancellations this week. Investors are watching. Keep the experience premium." Another said, "Do not over-discuss bare concerns unless guests ask directly. Fear ruins conversion." Ilara stared at the words. Fear to North Star was not a warning. It was bad marketing. Before leaving, Ilara told Lena that cooperation would not erase responsibility, but silence could multiply it. Lena nodded like someone receiving both judgment and mercy. That evening, Dr. Nora Keene called from the wildlife unit. The bear had survived sedation and examination. It was exhausted, disoriented, affected by spray, and temporarily trapped by deadfall, but there was no evidence of predatory behavior. The encounter appeared defensive or startled, likely caused by people entering too close to an active feeding area. Old small tracks had been found near the berry patch, though Nora would not yet confirm a cub. Ilara stood outside the NPS office as the news settled over her. The mountains glowed pink in the final light. Sable pressed his shoulder against her leg. She thought of Caleb on the hospital bed, of Marion's trembling hands, of Lena's tears, of a bear dragged into a human sales pitch, and then blamed for acting wild in the wild. The next morning, North Star held a second press conference. Dorian's sorrow had sharpened. This time he praised Caleb's service, then implied that military instincts might have led him to make unpredictable choices under stress. Caleb watched from his hospital room, face still and unreadable. Ilara stood beside the bed, Sable at her heel. When Dorian said, "North Star," could not be responsible for one man's split-second decisions, Caleb looked away toward the window. Ilara reached over and turned off the screen. "They are not just hiding the root," she said. "They are trying to bury the man who saved their clients." Sable stood, ears high, eyes fixed on the blank black television as if even he could hear the lie still humming in the room. The warrant did not come quickly, and Ilara Whitcomb was grateful for that. Fast justice made good television, but careful justice survived court. For 2 days, she moved between the NPS office, the temporary evidence room, and the small federal workspace in Kalispell, building the case piece by piece. Caleb's statement, Marion's trembling account, Peter's confirmation, Lena's screenshots, the memory card footage, the torn checklist, the expired bear spray, the silent GPS, the failed beacon. Every item was small alone, but together they formed a pattern as clear as tracks in fresh snow. Assistant U.S. Attorney Mara Vance reviewed each page with a hunter's patience, her pen tapping only when something needed tightening. "Dorian Vale will say this is all emotion," Mara warned. "Then we answer with timestamps," Ilara said. Sable lay under the table, his sable head resting on his paws, but his ears lifted every time Caleb's name was spoken. Outside, North Star Ridge Expeditions fought back through polished statements and sympathetic interviews. Dorian appeared on local news in a clean jacket, standing before a wall of framed mountain photographs, telling viewers that federal agencies were criminalizing wilderness risk. Some business owners in Columbia Falls echoed him. Tourism fed families. Empty cabins did not pay mortgages. Ilara understood their fear. She had seen small towns tremble when a large employer was threatened. But fear did not turn a false checklist into a true one. Fear did not make a dead GPS honest. And fear, she thought, was exactly what North Star had been selling to guests after dressing it in better clothes. On the third morning, Ilara returned to the scene with Walt Mercer and Sable. Caleb could not come. He was still in the hospital, still moving carefully, still waking from dreams with the smell of pine and bear spray caught somewhere in his throat. Instead, he joined by video call from his bed, his dark hair flattened on one side, his beard rougher now, his gray eyes tired but clear. Nurse Hannah had propped the phone on a tray table and warned him that if he tried to act heroic for longer than 20 minutes, she would confiscate his dignity along with the phone. Caleb had smiled weakly and obeyed. Ilara held her camera toward the narrow cut of forest. "Show me where you first saw the marker." Caleb studied the screen. "Back up 10 feet, left side, near the altar." His voice paused. "There. That orange tag wasn't right. Too clean. Too new. I remember thinking it didn't match the others." Walt stepped closer to the marker. It was a small plastic trail tag nailed to a tree trunk, weathered just enough to pass a quick glance. But Sable did not pass quick glances. The German shepherd approached, sniffed the base of the trunk, then lifted his nose to the tag itself. He did not scratch or bark. He simply sat, straight-backed and solemn, the way he did when something false wore the scent of something recent. Walt leaned in. "Fresh resin around the nail." Ilara photographed it. "Placed after the incident?" "Likely," Walt said, his jaw tightening. "This marker makes it look like the wrong turn belonged to Caleb." From the phone, Caleb was silent for a moment. They came back. Ilara looked at the trail tag, at the bright plastic pretending to be old, at the woods where a man and an animal had nearly been blamed for a decision made in an office. "Yes," she said, "someone came back." A single pine cone dropped from high above and struck the hollow trunk beside them with a sharp wooden knock. Sable's head snapped up. The sound rolled through the trees like a tiny gavel, and for one breath, nobody moved. Then the forest settled again, as if it had delivered its verdict and stepped back into silence. By afternoon, Mara had the strengthened warrant. NPS law enforcement entered North Star's main office and equipment storage with Ilara, Walt, and Sable. The office stood near a busy road outside Columbia Falls, trimmed with rustic wood and a bright sign showing a mountain ridge beneath a golden sun. Inside, everything smelled of cedar candles and printer ink. The front room displayed smiling photographs of guests in branded jackets, silver-haired couples on overlooks, families laughing beside wildflowers, all of them framed beneath words like safe, exclusive, unforgettable. Miles Harrow was there when they arrived. In person, he looked smaller than his voice had sounded on the radio. He was 42, narrow-shouldered, with thinning brown hair combed carefully over a pale scalp, a sharp nose, and eyes that moved too often toward doors, clocks, and phones. His fleece vest carried the North Star logo, but his posture carried dread. He said he was only operations. He said he followed established procedures. He said Dorian handled executive decisions. He said many things people said when the floor beneath them began to tilt. Ilara did not argue. She let the warrant speak. Sable worked the gear room slowly. He passed shelves of helmets, rain jackets, satellite messengers, and sealed snack kits. Near the back, he stopped before a row of hanging ponchos. His tail went still. Ilara moved the ponchos aside and found a locked metal cabinet built into the wall, nearly hidden behind a shelving unit. Miles's face lost color. "Key," Ilara said. "I don't—" "Miles," Mara said from behind her, voice mild and merciless. "Choose your next sentence like it matters." Miles gave them the key. Inside were bear spray canisters past inspection dates, 2 satellite beacons with swollen battery compartments, old route maps marked in red pencil, unsigned waiver forms, and a folder labeled Resolved Guest Incidents. Ilara opened it and found settlement letters, complaint summaries, and internal notes about previous close calls described publicly as client fatigue, weather confusion, or unexpected detours. Not disasters, perhaps, but warnings, little bells rung in the dark and ignored. Then Lena Crow arrived with the email. She looked pale, thinner somehow, her ash-blonde hair tucked under a knit cap and her hands bare despite the cold. Ilara met her outside before the others saw the tears she was holding back. Lena handed over printed copies and a flash drive. "I found this in an old work account," she said. "Dorian sent it after a guest complained that we talked too much about bear precautions." Ilara read the sentence once, then again. "Fear ruins premium experience." The words were not dramatic. That made them worse. They were clean, corporate, and cruel in the way only polished language could be cruel. Ilara thought of Marion clutching her emergency blanket, Peter's bent glasses, Caleb asking whether they made it, the bear waking confused in a world humans kept renaming for profit. Miles watched Lena hand over the email. Something in him collapsed. Not courage exactly, but the failure of cowardice. He asked to speak with counsel, then agreed to cooperate. Dorian, he explained, rarely gave direct illegal orders. He praised staff who protected the brand. He cut hours for guides who canceled trips. He moved warnings into internal folders and told marketing not to overload guests with fear language. After the incident, he told Miles to retrieve any equipment that might confuse the narrative. Miles had moved the trail marker and helped hide faulty gear. He had also seen Dorian preparing to transfer company data to an out-of-state server and clear out a secondary storage site near Whitefish Lake. That name struck Caleb when Ilara called him later from the office. He closed his eyes, searching through pain and fog. "Whitefish Lake," he said slowly. Northstar had an old boathouse lease there. Guides joked it was where gear went when it didn't want to meet inspectors. Ilara looked at Mara. Mara was already reaching for her phone. Before evening, Dr. Nora Keene sent another update from the wildlife unit. Camera footage near the berry patch showed a large bear moving through the area days before the encounter, and, in one distant frame, a smaller shape trailing far behind. Nora remained cautious, as good scientists were, but the conclusion was enough for immediate safety action. The connector would stay closed, the area reassessed, and the collared bear monitored rather than punished. No predatory pattern, no villain in fur. Only an animal startled in a place humans should have respected. Night settled over Whitefish Lake in shades of blue and silver. The water reflected the first stars, and the mountains stood like silent witnesses around it. Ilara arrived with Sable, Mara, NPS officers, and federal agents, warrant in hand. The old North Star boathouse sat at the end of a gravel lane, its windows dark except for one thin line of light beneath a side door. Then the light went out. Sable moved to the door, lowered his nose to the crack, and inhaled. He looked back at Ilara, ears high, body still as carved stone. Ilara felt the old pull of truth, not loud, not dramatic, but steady as a heartbeat under the earth. Dorian had begun to run. This time, the forest was not the only thing tracking him, and this time the truth was faster. Mist lay over Whitefish Lake like a silver veil when the federal team entered the old North Star boathouse. The building sat at the edge of the water, weathered gray boards leaning against the morning, its windows dull with old dust and lake spray. Inside, the air smelled of mildew, rope, and cold metal. Ilara Whitcomb stepped through, first with K9 Sable close at her side, the 5-year-old German shepherd moving with careful dignity. Sable coat, dark in the dim light, ears high, nose reading the room before any human could. Behind her came NPS officers, Mara Vance, and 2 evidence technicians carrying cameras and sealed boxes. They found what Dorian Vale had tried to hide in the back office, behind a false panel covered by faded life jackets. There were original wildlife warnings with Walt Mercer's name on them, route maps showing the true paths North Star had used, lists of expired safety gear, customer complaints marked resolved, and records showing GPS logs had been disabled on more than one premium trip. One printed email carried Dorian's polished cruelty in plain language. Cancellations would damage investor confidence. Another warned staff not to frighten guests with unnecessary wildlife emphasis. Ilara stood over the files in silence. No single page shouted. Together they sang like a choir of small ignored alarms. Dorian was taken into custody later that morning at a private airfield outside Kalispell, not because he was simply running, but because the evidence finally gave shape to the truth. He had built a system that hid risk, softened warnings, changed routes, failed to inspect equipment, and then tried to make Caleb Rourke look responsible for a disaster he had tried to prevent. North Star's permit access was suspended. Civil claims began forming before noon. A victims fund was ordered through the early settlement process, and every local tour company in the region suddenly found itself reviewing safety protocols with more humility than pride. Miles Harrow cooperated fully after the boathouse search. He accepted responsibility for moving the trail marker and concealing faulty gear, his face pale and smaller each time he spoke. Lena Crow also testified. She was not treated as spotless. Her guide license was suspended while she completed retraining, and she accepted that consequence without protest. When she later stood before a class of new trail guides, her ash-blonde hair pulled back and her voice trembling but steady, she said, "A canceled trip can disappoint a guest. A careless trip can change a family forever." No one in that room looked away. At the reopening ceremony weeks later, a gust of wind moved through the pines and struck the new wooden safety sign, making it knock once against its post. The sound was small, almost gentle, but everyone turned toward it. For one suspended breath, the forest seemed to be asking whether the humans had finally learned to listen. Ranger Walt Mercer stood near that sign with his hat in both hands. At 62, his weathered face seemed older in the morning light, but lighter too. The warnings he had sent and North Star had ignored were now part of the official record. No one called him overly cautious anymore. Alara watched him blink hard as a group of older visitors read the new notice. Respect the wild. Prepare with honesty. Return with gratitude. Walt didn't say much. Men like him rarely did when something sacred had been bruised and then partly mended. Caleb Rourke recovered slowly, the way real men recovered when the body had been asked for more than it should have given. His shoulder still troubled him. Some nights he woke hearing the bent whistle in his dreams. He did not return to guiding right away. Instead, with Alara, Walt, and NPS support, he helped create the Safe Passage Trail Initiative, a program for older hikers, families, and new guides. He taught people how to walk in groups, check beacons, carry bear spray properly, read wildlife warnings, and understand that nature was not a theater built for human pride. Marion Wells and Peter Lang returned to Montana in early summer. Marion wore a soft blue cardigan despite the sun, her silver blonde hair pinned neatly, her face still gentle but changed by gratitude. Peter, with repaired glasses and a quieter smile, carried his camera but took fewer pictures. Marion brought a pressed wildflower kept inside the small Bible that had belonged to her late husband. She placed it beneath the new sign, then turned to Caleb with tears shining in her eyes. "You gave me time to come home," she said. Caleb looked uncomfortable with praise, his gray eyes lowering to the ground. "I only bought you a little time, ma'am. Agent Whitcomb and Sable brought us all the rest of the way." Marion then knelt carefully before Sable and tied a forest green bandana around his neck. In pale stitching it read, "The one who heard the forest first." Sable sniffed the cloth, paused with grave importance, then sneezed so sharply that Peter laughed out loud. The laughter spread softly through the group. It did not erase what had happened. It simply let light sit beside it. Later that afternoon, at the Lake McDonald Ranger Station, Alara, Caleb, Walt, and Sable watched wildlife camera footage on a small monitor. The image was grainy, washed in dawn blue light. A large bear moved through a distant valley far from the tourist trail, her collared neck lowering as she passed through tall grass. Far behind her, at the edge of the frame, a smaller shape moved for only a moment before vanishing into brush. "Doctor?" Nora Keene had been careful with her report, as careful people should be. The bear was being monitored. She had shown no pattern of approaching busy areas. The encounter had been defensive, born from surprise and human carelessness. Caleb leaned closer to the screen. His voice was barely above a whisper. So she made it too. Ilara watched the bear disappear beyond the trees. She was never the villain. Those words stayed with her. Ilara had spent years believing rescue meant reaching the lost before silence closed around them. But this case had taught her something wider. Rescue could also mean restoring truth. It could mean refusing to punish an animal for being wild. It could mean helping a frightened guide speak, letting an old ranger be heard, and teaching a brave man that protection did not always require standing alone in front of danger. Sometimes protection was a sign, a class, a working beacon, an honest warning before the first boot touched the trail. By sunset, the reopened path glowed gold beneath the pines. Ilara walked with Sable along the controlled section of trail, the dog's new bandana moving gently against his sable coat. Behind them, Caleb stood with a small group of older hikers, showing them how to check wind direction and keep their voices calm but present. He looked thinner than before, still healing, but something in him had steadied. He was no longer only the man who had faced fear in the forest. He had become the man teaching others how to come home. Sable stopped once and looked back at Ilara, brown eyes deep and warm, as if some ancient part of the woods had borrowed his gaze. Ilara rested her hand on his head. Lake McDonald shimmered through the trees, bright as a promise. In the forest, where a lie had tried to hide beneath pine needles, the truth had finally found its way home. Then Ilara and Sable stepped forward together, following the trail into the light. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not arrive with thunder or bright lights. Sometimes they arrive as a loyal dog pausing beneath the pine trees, a wounded man still asking if others survived, an old ranger finally being heard, or a truth rising from the ground after everyone thought it had been buried. This story reminds us that courage is not always about strength. Sometimes courage is restraint. Sometimes it is honesty. Sometimes it is choosing to protect life even when no one is watching. Caleb did not become a hero because he was fearless. He became one because in a moment of danger he remembered that other lives mattered. Ilara did not bring justice because she was powerful. She brought justice because she listened carefully, followed the truth, and trusted the quiet instinct of a faithful animal. And Sable reminds us of something many people forget. Animals are not just background in our lives. They feel, notice, protect, and sometimes guide us toward what our own hearts are too busy to see. The bear was not a villain. It was a living creature trying to survive in its own home. That is a lesson for all of us. We must walk through this world with respect, whether we are entering a forest, caring for a pet, helping a neighbor, or speaking to someone who is hurting. In everyday life, we may not face a mountain trail or a dangerous moment in the wild. But we all face choices. We can ignore a warning, or we can speak up. We can follow the crowd, or we can do what is right. We can treat animals, strangers, and the vulnerable as inconveniences, or we can see them as lives placed in our path for a reason. Maybe that is where God's quiet miracles live, not only in the rescue itself, but in the hearts that refuse to give up, in the hand that reaches out, in the dog that hears what people miss, in the second chance that comes just when hope seems far away. So let this story be a gentle reminder. Live with kindness, tell the truth even when it is difficult, protect those who cannot speak for themselves, and never treat nature or animals as things to be used carelessly. Love deeply, walk humbly, help when you can, and when life gives you the chance to do the right thing, take it. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who believes in courage, loyalty, and second chances. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from, or share a moment when an animal brought light into your life. And if you want more stories of faith, hope, justice, and the powerful bond between humans and animals, please subscribe to the channel. May God bless you, protect your family, watch over the animals we love, and guide each of us to live with a kinder heart every day.